15 years ago, on a rain-soaked Christmas night in Ohio, a 15-year-old boy named Marcus Hill waited by the window for his father to come home. He never did. His father's car was found crushed on the highway, ruled an accident before questions could be asked. But Marcus saw what no report recorded: a hooded man stepping away from the wreck, a face burned into his memory. Now Marcus is a U.S. police officer, quiet, disciplined, and relentless. When that same face resurfaces years later, wealthy, protected, and revealed to be the son of a powerful judge, Marcus knows the truth will demand more than a badge. It will demand sacrifice, because sometimes justice means being watched, doubted, and almost destroyed before the truth can stand. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. The rain began before sunset. In the small industrial town of Riverside, Ohio, December always arrived early and without mercy. Old brick factories lined the outskirts like tired giants, their smokestacks silent now, relics of better decades. That Christmas Eve, the sky hung low and heavy, swollen with clouds the color of bruised steel. Cold rain lashed the streets, driven sideways by wind that howled through bare trees and rattled loose signs along Main Street. It was the kind of weather that made the town feel even smaller, as if the storm itself were closing in. Inside a modest two-story house near the edge of town, Marcus Hill sat by the living room window. Marcus was 15. Tall for his age, still carrying the awkwardness of a body growing faster than confidence could catch up. His skin was a deep, warm brown, his face narrow with high cheekbones inherited from his father. His hair was cut short, uneven at the edges where his mother had trimmed it herself. His eyes, dark and observant, had the habit of watching more than speaking. Teachers often described him as quiet but sharp, a boy who listened carefully before deciding whether words were worth using. Tonight, Marcus held a small, unevenly wrapped box in his hands. The paper was cheap, decorated with faded snowmen, and one corner had been taped twice where he'd torn it by mistake. Inside was a leather keychain he'd saved weeks to buy. Simple, sturdy, something his father would actually use. He turned it slowly, thumb tracing the folded edge of the wrapping, glancing again at the clock above the television. 7:42 p.m. His father should have been home already. From the kitchen came the faint clatter of dishes. Elaine Hill, Marcus's mother, moved quietly, her steps careful as if she didn't want to disturb the fragile calm of the evening. She was a slender woman in her early 40s, with soft features and tired eyes that had learned to smile even when worry lived behind them. Her hair, once worn long, was now pulled into a low bun streaked with early gray. Stress, not age, had put it there. "Your dad called," she said gently, appearing in the doorway. "He said traffic was bad. He promised he'd be home soon." Marcus nodded, forcing a smile he didn't feel. He always keeps his promises. Elaine hesitated, then nodded too, as if reassuring herself. He does. Daniel Hill was a man who kept promises. At least, that's how Marcus had always known him. Daniel was 45, broad-shouldered but lean, with the posture of someone who carried responsibility even when sitting down. His skin was a shade lighter than Marcus's, his hair cropped close with flecks of gray at the temples. He dressed simply, pressed shirts, plain coats, but everything about him carried quiet dignity. He worked as a financial systems engineer for North Vale Group, a massive corporate conglomerate with interests in manufacturing, logistics, and infrastructure across the Midwest. To Marcus, his father wasn't a corporate employee. He was the man who fixed broken radios, who explained math with patience, who believed rules mattered even when the world didn't seem to care. Daniel believed deeply in fairness, in doing things the right way. It was a belief that had cost him more than Marcus understood at the time. The wind rattled the window. Marcus pressed his forehead lightly against the cold glass, peering down the street. Headlights passed occasionally, blurred by rain, but none slowed near their house. 7:58 p.m. Somewhere miles away, Daniel Hill's car skidded on wet asphalt. The crash itself was sudden, violent, and final. Daniel never saw the truck until it was too late. The impact sent his sedan spinning, metal screaming as it slammed into the guardrail and flipped, coming to rest upside down in a shallow ditch off the highway. Minutes later, red and blue lights cut through the storm. Back in the living room, Marcus flinched as distant sirens wailed, faint but unmistakable. He straightened, heart tightening. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elaine froze, listening. For a moment the sirens seemed to fade, carried away by the wind. She exhaled slowly. "It's probably nothing, baby." But Marcus was already pulling on his jacket. The road was slick, the rain soaking through his sneakers as he ran toward the glow of emergency lights in the distance. Each step felt unreal, like moving through water. When he reached the highway, the scene unfolded before him in fragments. Twisted metal, shattered glass, police officers shouting over the storm. Then he saw the car. It was his father's. Marcus stopped breathing. An officer tried to block his path, but Marcus slipped past, his eyes locked on the wreckage. Paramedics moved quickly, their faces grim. Someone placed a blanket over a still form being lifted onto a stretcher. The world narrowed to sound and rain in the pounding of his own heart. And then, in the chaos, Marcus saw something else. A man stood several yards away, partially hidden by the shadow of a highway sign. He wore a dark hooded jacket pulled low over his head. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't shouting. He was watching, calm, controlled. As lightning split the sky, the hood shifted. For a single, terrible second, Marcus saw the man's face, sharp features, pale skin, eyes that flicked toward Marcus, cold and assessing before the man turned and disappeared into the rain. The thunder came late, crashing over the scene like a verdict. The official report came quickly, too quickly. Accident due to weather conditions, they said. Loss of control. No evidence of foul play. Daniel Hill was pronounced dead at the scene. That same night, miles away in a glass-walled office on the top floor of North Vale Group's regional headquarters, an email reached a federal oversight inbox. It was sent from a private account, routed through multiple servers. The subject line was simple: financial irregularities, immediate review required. The sender laid out everything: misappropriated funds, manipulated audits, a pattern of sidelining black executives and engineers who asked too many questions. Attached were spreadsheets, internal memos, timestamps. The sender was Daniel Hill. 28 minutes later, the email was flagged. 2 minutes after that, it was quietly buried under layers of internal filters and legal holds. No reply was ever sent. Back in Riverside, Ohio, Marcus stood under a flickering streetlight, rain soaking his clothes, staring at the empty road where the hooded man had vanished. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply stood there, memorizing the shape of the night. Somewhere deep inside, something broke. And something else, harder, colder, began to form. The town moved on quickly. Within 48 hours, the police report was filed, stamped, and closed. Weather-related accident, the officers said with rehearsed calm. Hydroplaning, no signs of foul play. The words were repeated on local news, then printed once in the Riverside Gazette, and finally forgotten beneath holiday advertisements and year-end sales. The rain slowed. Snow began to fall in thin, dirty sheets, and the highway was cleared as if nothing irreversible had happened there. For the Hill family, time did not move forward. It collapsed inward. The funeral was held 3 days later, on Christmas morning, in a small chapel at the edge of town. The sky couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Rain fell steadily, but wet snow clung to coats and umbrellas, melting into mud underfoot. The cemetery smelled of cold earth and damp pine. Folding chairs creaked beneath the weight of winter coats and quiet grief. Marcus stood at the front, beside the casket. He wore a black coat borrowed from a neighbor, sleeves slightly too long. His shoulders were squared, his posture rigid, as if he were holding himself together through sheer force of will. His face was still, no tears, no tremor. Only his eyes moved, fixed on the polished wood of the coffin as though staring long enough might force it open. At 15, Marcus already looked older than his years. Grief had stripped away whatever softness childhood had left. People whispered about how strong he was, how brave. No one noticed that his hands were clenched so tightly his fingernails cut into his palms. Near the casket, resting on a folded flag, lay a police badge. It belonged to Officer Raymond Cole, a middle-aged local cop with thinning hair and a permanent crease between his brows. Cole was not a bad man, but he was a tired one. Decades of small-town policing had taught him to avoid trouble rather than chase it. He spoke gently to Elaine Hill, offered condolences, and assured her, quietly, professionally, that everything had been done by the book. Elaine listened, nodding automatically. She stood beside Marcus, dressed in a simple black dress that hung loosely on her slender frame. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. Elaine had cried herself hollow in the days before the funeral. Now she seemed emptied out, moving and breathing on instinct alone. She held Marcus's arm, as if anchoring herself to something solid, something that hadn't been taken yet. When the pastor spoke of Daniel Hill's integrity, his commitment to fairness, his love for family, Marcus finally shifted his gaze. He looked down, not at the casket, but at the badge. The metal caught the dull winter light. In that moment, something inside him settled into place. Marcus did not speak his promise aloud. He didn't need to. It formed quietly, deliberately, with the certainty of something carved in stone. If the world refused to protect the innocent, he would learn how. If the law could be bent to bury the truth, he would learn how it broke. And one day, he would wear that badge, not as a symbol of authority, but as a weapon against silence. After the burial, people lingered briefly, offering food, murmured prayers, and sympathetic looks before retreating back to their lives. The Hills returned to their house, now unbearably quiet. Daniel's shoes still sat by the door. His coat still hung on the hook where he'd left it the night he never came home. Elaine moved through the rooms slowly, touching things as if to confirm they were real. The weight of finances pressed in quickly, mortgage payments, medical bills, legal costs she didn't yet understand. Daniel had been the steady center of their world. Without him, everything felt precarious. 2 weeks later, the for sale sign appeared on the front lawn. Marcus watched from his bedroom window as strangers toured the house, commenting on the kitchen, the yard, the neighborhood. Each visit felt like another erasure. Elaine made the decision with quiet resolve. Grief had sharpened her practicality. Riverside held too many memories, too many questions no one wanted answered. The night before they left town, Elaine called Marcus into the living room. She sat at the dining table, shoulders slumped, a small cardboard box in front of her. The lamp above cast a soft, yellow glow, deepening the shadows beneath her eyes. "There's something your father left," she said. Marcus sat across from her, alert now in a way he hadn't been since the funeral. From the box, Elaine pulled out a battered USB drive. It was scratched, the plastic casing slightly cracked at one corner. "I found this in his desk," she said quietly. "He told me once it was just work files. I didn't think much of it." She paused, fingers tightening around the drive. "After the accident, I tried to open it on our computer. It was password protected. I didn't know what to do with it." She slid the USB across the table toward Marcus. "I don't understand what's on it," she continued, voice trembling. "But your father was careful. If he kept this hidden, it mattered." Marcus picked up the drive, turning it over in his fingers. It felt heavier than it should have, dense with meaning he couldn't yet access. "I want you to keep it," Elaine said. "Not because I expect you to do anything with it now, just don't lose it." Marcus nodded. "I won't." In the days that followed, Riverside disappeared behind them mile by mile. They moved south, staying first with a distant cousin, then settling into a small apartment near Columbus. The transition was abrupt, disorienting. New school, new streets, new faces. Marcus learned quickly that grief was easier to manage when no one knew your story. He kept to himself, studied harder, ran longer, pushed his body until exhaustion quieted his thoughts. Teachers noticed his discipline. Coaches noticed his endurance. Few noticed the anger he kept tightly leashed beneath the surface. At night, Marcus sometimes dreamed of rain and flashing lights, of a hood lifting, of a face he could never forget. He kept the USB hidden inside a sock, buried at the bottom of his drawer. He didn't try to open it again. Not yet. Some instincts told him timing mattered, that rushing toward the truth without the strength to face it would only bury it deeper. Years later, he would understand how right that instinct was. But for now, all Marcus had was a promise made in silence, and the patience to keep it. 15 years can harden a boy into something unrecognizable. Chicago did not welcome Marcus Hill gently. The city rose around him in steel and concrete, loud, impatient, unforgiving. Wind cut through the streets like a blade in winter, and summer heat pressed down with a violence that matched the sirens echoing day and night. It was a city that demanded resilience, and Marcus gave it exactly that. At 30, Marcus stood well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and solid, his body shaped by years of disciplined training rather than vanity. His head was kept close-cropped, practical and severe. His face carried the calm of someone who had learned how to control anger instead of letting it control him. Only his eyes betrayed him. Dark, steady, always alert, with a quiet intensity that unsettled both criminals and colleagues alike. Among the Chicago Police Department, Marcus had built a reputation quickly. He was known as reliable, incorruptible, and difficult. He didn't joke much. He didn't socialize after shifts. He followed procedure to the letter, but never allowed procedure to become an excuse for injustice. When pressured by supervisors to let things go, Marcus listened politely and then kept digging anyway. Those who lived in the neighborhoods he patrolled trusted him. He spoke to people instead of at them. He remembered names. He waited, even when patience cost him promotions. That patience had been forged over 15 years of quiet endurance. Late nights studying criminal law, early mornings running until his lungs burned, and countless moments when rage threatened to surface and he forced it back down. The USB drive still existed. It now lived in a locked drawer in Marcus's apartment, wrapped in cloth, untouched but never forgotten. It was not fear that kept him from opening it. It was instinct. Marcus understood something most people didn't. Timing mattered. Power protected itself viciously, and truth released too early often died alone. The case that changed everything arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. It began as a routine financial crimes briefing, money laundering through shell corporations tied to real estate development on the South Side. Marcus listened, arms folded, eyes scanning projected documents as analysts spoke in clipped, detached tones. Names blurred past until one slid onto the screen and stopped his breath cold. Ethan Whitmore. The room didn't change. No one else reacted. To them, it was just another wealthy businessman, CEO of a private investment firm, donor to political campaigns, patron of charity galas. To Marcus, the name detonated something buried deep in his chest. The photograph appeared seconds later. Time seemed to slow. Ethan Whitmore was in his mid-40s now, his hair neatly styled with touches of gray at the temples. He wore tailored suits and practiced confidence, the kind that came from never having been told no. His face had aged, refined itself, but the structure was unmistakable. Sharp features, pale skin, eyes that looked through people rather than at them, the same eyes Marcus had seen under a lightning-split sky 15 years ago. Marcus said nothing. He didn't react. He didn't blink. Inside, the fire roared. After the briefing, Marcus walked alone through the underground parking garage, boots echoing against concrete. His breathing was slow, controlled. He replayed the image again and again, overlaying it with memory. The rain, the hood, the calm retreat from a wreck that should have drawn panic. It wasn't coincidence. Marcus knew that, with a certainty, that went beyond logic. That night, Marcus made a call he hadn't planned to make for years. Lucas Grant answered on the second ring. Lucas had been Marcus's friend back in Columbus, a sharp-tongued, relentlessly curious kid who never learned when to stop asking questions. Now, in his early 30s, Lucas had grown into a civil rights attorney with a lean build, restless energy, and eyes that missed nothing. He wore his hair slightly too long for courtrooms, and his suits like armor he resented but respected. "Marcus Hill," Lucas said, surprise softening into warmth. "I was starting to think you'd disappeared into that badge." "Not yet," Marcus replied. "I need your help." They met the following evening in a quiet diner near the Loop. Lucas listened without interrupting as Marcus laid out only what was necessary: names, timelines, instincts. When Marcus finished, Lucas leaned back, jaw tight. "You're saying the man tied to this laundering operation might be connected to your father's death," Lucas said carefully. "I'm saying I recognize his face," Marcus replied. "And he's Judge Richard Whitmore's son." That name landed heavily between them. Judge Richard Whitmore was a figure even people outside the legal world recognized. A state-level judge with decades on the bench, known publicly for his commitment to order and tradition. He was tall, silver-haired, and immaculately composed, with a reputation for favoring precedent over reform. To many, he was stability. To others, he was a gatekeeper. Lucas exhaled slowly. "That's not a small enemy." "I'm not looking for an enemy," Marcus said. "I'm looking for the truth." Lucas studied him, then nodded. "Then you'll need more than a badge." The third thread entered quietly. Emily Carter did not look like trouble, which was precisely why she often found it. She was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with sharp cheekbones and watchful gray eyes that missed very little. Her dark blonde hair was usually pulled back into a loose ponytail. Practical rather than polished. Emily spoke softly, asked questions gently, and refused to let go once she had assent. Marcus first encountered her at a press briefing months earlier. She'd asked about a closed case involving a North Vale Group subsidiary. The question had been dismissed. Emily hadn't been. Now, Lucas introduced them in a bookstore cafe far from downtown. "She's been investigating North Vale for 2 years," Lucas said, "and someone's been trying very hard to scare her off." Emily didn't smile. "Threats, surveillance, a break-in that wasn't a robbery," she said calmly. "The usual ways powerful people say hello." Marcus watched her closely. "Why keep going?" Emily hesitated for half a second. "My father worked for a corporation that buried its own crimes. He testified once. Lost everything after." She met Marcus's gaze. "Some stories don't let you walk away." Something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, not comfort. They didn't form an alliance that night. There were no handshakes, no vows. Just an understanding that 3 separate paths were converging toward the same buried truth. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked his case from the inside, careful and methodical. He followed money flows that brushed too close to Ethan Whitmore's businesses. He documented inconsistencies. He noted how often leads stalled once they approached certain legal boundaries. Lucas dug into court records, mapping patterns, cases dismissed, evidence excluded, rulings that quietly benefited the same financial circles. Emily followed paper trails no one else thought mattered. Charity donations, shell nonprofits, old Northvale connections that never quite disappeared. Each step forward was met with resistance. Supervisors warned Marcus to stay in his lane. Lucas received calls suggesting he reconsider his focus. Emily found her sources growing suddenly afraid. Still, the fire burned. Late one night, alone in his apartment, Marcus unlocked the drawer and removed the USB. He didn't plug it in yet. He simply held it, feeling the weight of 15 years press into his palm. Ethan Whitmore was real. The past had teeth, and for the first time since that night in the rain, Marcus allowed himself to believe that the promise he made in silence might one day be heard. The closer Marcus Hill moved toward the truth, the more the ground beneath him shifted. Chicago taught him quickly that power did not panic. It redirected. Ethan Whitmore never appeared at crime scenes, never signed documents himself, never raised his voice. His money flowed through holding companies with neutral names, his contracts buried beneath layers of legal insulation. On paper, everything was clean. In reality, Marcus began to see the pattern. Shell corporations feeding real estate projects, inflated service contracts, charitable foundations that existed only to move money quietly across state lines. Marcus followed patiently. He learned Ethan's routines without being seen: private gyms at dawn, late dinners in glass-walled restaurants, discreet meetings in hotel lounges where security cameras conveniently malfunctioned. Ethan was tall, well-groomed, always composed, his manner relaxed in the way of men who had never feared consequences. He spoke politely to staff, tipped generously, and never appeared rushed. It was control perfected through privilege. Each report Marcus submitted was precise and restrained. He avoided accusations, focusing only on facts, hoping the system might respond if presented with undeniable evidence. Instead, the system responded to him. First came the transfer. Without warning, Marcus was reassigned from financial crimes to routine patrol in a different district. No explanation beyond operational needs. His supervisor, Captain Harold Vance, a heavyset man with thinning hair and a voice worn down by compromise, avoided eye contact when delivering the news. Vance wasn't cruel. He was cautious, shaped by years of watching careers end suddenly for reasons never written down. "You're a good cop," Vance said quietly, "but you're stepping into waters that don't belong to us." Marcus nodded, thanked him, and packed his locker without protest. Patrol work didn't stop Marcus. It slowed him, forced him to adapt. He collected details the long way, off-duty observation, public records, conversations that never sounded like interviews. But the pressure increased. Internal Affairs called him in twice, questioning his conduct on unrelated arrests. Anonymous complaints appeared in his file, accusing him of harassment, excessive force, misuse of authority. None were substantiated, but each left a mark. Marcus understood the strategy. Exhaust him, discredit him, isolate him. He responded the only way he knew how, by becoming quieter. Lucas Grant felt the pressure from a different direction. In his modest law office, surrounded by case files and half-drunk coffee cups, Lucas noticed a pattern that refused to stay buried. Ethan Whitmore's name appeared repeatedly, not as a defendant, but as an invisible beneficiary. Lawsuits collapsed unexpectedly. Evidence was ruled inadmissible without explanation. Judges cited precedent selectively, always to Whitmore's advantage. Lucas mapped it all on a corkboard, red string connecting cases across years and counties. At the center sat a familiar name: Richard Whitmore. Judge Whitmore had never directly presided over Ethan's cases. He didn't need to. Lucas discovered quiet procedural shifts. Judges promoted shortly after favorable rulings. Prosecutors reassigned mid-case. Motions delayed until witnesses lost nerve or funding dried up. Lucas's appearance reflected the toll. His suits hung looser now, his face sharper, eyes shadowed by nights spent reading transcripts. He had always been idealistic, but years of defending clients crushed by systems stacked against them had hardened his resolve. He no longer expected fairness. He demanded accountability. When Lucas attempted to file a motion reopening an old North Vale-related civil case, the clerk hesitated. 2 days later, Lucas received a polite call from a senior attorney advising him to focus on matters within his expertise. The message was clear. Emily Carter's danger arrived unannounced. She met her source in a public library on the outskirts of the city, a place chosen for its anonymity rather than safety. The man waited near the history section, hands trembling as he pretended to read. His name was Walter Pierce, late 50s, once an operations supervisor for North Vale Group. Years of factory oversight had left him stooped, his skin pale and lined, his eyes permanently wary. Walter spoke softly, every sentence measured. 15 years earlier, he had been questioned after Daniel Hill's death. He had seen inconsistencies, noticed altered logs, been instructed to clarify his statement. When he hesitated, a corporate attorney reminded him of his pension, his mortgage, his sick wife. Walter complied. He survived. The guilt never left. Emily listened without interrupting. She didn't push. Her style wasn't force, it was patience. She understood fear intimately. Early in her career, a source had disappeared after testifying, and the memory shaped everything she did afterward. She had learned that courage arrived only when fear felt seen. Walter finally handed her a folder. Inside were copies, maintenance schedules, internal memos, a handwritten note documenting the night Daniel Hill died. "I can't go to court," Walter whispered, "but I can give you this." Emily promised nothing she couldn't keep. She simply said, "Thank you." The break-in happened 2 nights later. Emily returned to her apartment to find drawers open, files disturbed, her laptop missing. Nothing else was taken. The message wasn't subtle. She reported it, knowing nothing would come of it. When she told Marcus and Lucas, her voice remained calm, but her hand shook. "This is escalation," Lucas said. "It means we're close," Marcus replied. The 3 of them met less often now, careful not to create patterns. When they did, it was brief. Exchanges of information, not comfort. Trust had formed quietly between them, born not of optimism but of shared risk. Marcus endured another blow when Internal Affairs opened a formal inquiry into his conduct. He was placed on administrative leave pending review. His badge was taken temporarily, his weapon secured. The rumor mill moved faster than facts. Some colleagues avoided him. Others offered sympathetic nods, but no words. Marcus returned home that night and sat in the dark. He removed the USB from its hiding place and finally plugged it in. The files inside were dense, technical, precise. Daniel Hill's work. Financial pathways Marcus now recognized, links that connected North Vale to entities still operating under different names. The evidence was older but foundational. Proof that corruption hadn't begun recently. It had been engineered. Marcus closed the laptop before dawn. By the end of the week, Lucas confirmed what Marcus already suspected. Reopening cases would require evidence so public it could not be buried quietly. Emily's materials, Marcus's documentation, Daniel's files, they were fragments of the same truth. Separately, they were vulnerable. Together, they were dangerous. None of them said it aloud, but each understood the cost. Careers would end. Reputations would be destroyed. Safety was no longer guaranteed. Yet none of them stepped away. Truth, Marcus realized, was not a solitary act. It survived only when carried by many hands, and for the first time since he was 15, He felt something unexpected rise alongside the fire. Hope. The courthouse rose over downtown Chicago like a monument to certainty. Gray stone, wide steps, flags hanging stiff in the cold air. It projected order, permanence, and authority. On the morning the trial began, reporters clustered behind barricades, cameras balanced on shoulders, voices low but urgent. Inside, security was heavier than usual. The case had drawn attention long before opening arguments were scheduled. Marcus Hill walked through the metal detectors without a badge. Administrative leave had stripped him of formal authority, but not of presence. He wore a dark suit instead of a uniform, tailored simply, his posture straight, his expression controlled. Years of discipline kept his face neutral, though his pulse beat steadily in his throat. This was not how he had imagined stepping into a courtroom tied to his father's death, but imagination had never mattered much in his life. Inside Courtroom 3B, shadows gathered early. At the bench sat Judge Richard Whitmore. He was a tall man in his late 60s, his silver hair combed precisely, his judicial robe hanging perfectly from narrow shoulders. His face was composed to the point of austerity, lines carved deep by decades of command. Whitmore's reputation preceded him: meticulous, unemotional, unwavering. He believed deeply in hierarchy and decorum, in the idea that stability mattered more than disruption. To many, he was the embodiment of the law's dignity. To Marcus, he was something else entirely. At the defense table sat Ethan Whitmore. He looked relaxed, almost bored. His suit was custom-made, his cufflinks understated but expensive. He leaned back slightly in his chair, hands folded loosely, offering polite nods to attorneys and court staff alike. The years had been good to him. Power had smoothed every rough edge. The confidence he carried wasn't arrogance. It was certainty, the kind that came from never having lost. Ethan did not look at Marcus. Lucas Grant sat several rows back, legal pads stacked neatly on his lap. His jaw was set, his eyes sharp behind thin-framed glasses. He had shed any illusion that this would be a fair fight. Still, he had come prepared. Every motion, every precedent memorized. Lucas had learned long ago that when justice failed, documentation remained. Emily Carter took her place near the press section. She wore a charcoal coat, hair pulled back tightly, her expression unreadable. Overnight, her investigation into North Vale Group and Ethan Whitmore had gone public. Headlines screamed of corruption, buried evidence, and judicial influence. Her articles were meticulous, restrained, impossible to dismiss as speculation. She had released everything at once: documents, interviews, timelines, leaving no room for quiet suppression. The courtroom buzzed with restrained tension. Judge Whitmore struck the gavel. Proceedings began smoothly, too smoothly. Objections were raised and sustained with predictable precision. Evidence introduced by the prosecution was dissected mercilessly. Motions filed by Lucas on behalf of reopened interests were dismissed on technical grounds. Witnesses hesitated, glancing nervously toward the bench before answering. Marcus watched the choreography unfold. This was not justice. It was theater. Midway through the morning, Marcus was called unexpectedly. "Mr. Hill," Judge Whitmore said evenly, peering over the rim of his glasses, "your presence here is unusual given your status." Marcus stood slowly. "I'm here as a citizen." Whitmore's gaze lingered. "You are reminded that any attempt to interfere with proceedings will be addressed accordingly." It was a warning. Public. Calculated. The prosecution attempted to introduce financial data linking Ethan Whitmore to shell corporations connected to North Vale. Judge Whitmore excluded it, citing chain of custody issues. Emily's published findings were deemed journalistic material, not admissible evidence. One witness suddenly claimed memory failure, another recanted entirely. By early afternoon, the room felt suffocating. Then Lucas stood, He requested permission to introduce historical documentation related to Northvale Group's internal audits from 15 years earlier. Judge Whitmore hesitated, just a fraction too long. "Denied," he said. "Relevance has not been established." Lucas nodded once and sat. He had expected it. What Judge Whitmore did not expect was Marcus Hill stepping forward. "I request to submit evidence as a private citizen," Marcus said calmly, "with the court's permission." The room went still. Judge Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "On what basis?" Marcus reached into his briefcase and removed a small object, placing it gently on the evidence table. "A digital archive belonging to Daniel Hill," Marcus said. "My father." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. "This archive contains his final correspondence," Marcus continued, voice steady, "including an email sent to a federal oversight body detailing financial crimes, racial discrimination, and internal suppression within Northvale Group. It also contains financial data corroborating ongoing money laundering activity tied to the defendant." Judge Whitmore leaned back slightly. "Objection," he said himself. "This court will not—" At that moment, the courtroom doors opened. A man stepped inside slowly. He was in his early 70s, thin, his back bent slightly as if from years of carrying more than his body should have borne. His hair was sparse and white, his face lined deeply, eyes tired but resolute. He wore a plain suit that had seen better days. This was Thomas Keller, a former traffic division officer. Keller's career had ended abruptly 15 years earlier after what had been described as procedural misconduct. Few remembered him now. Fewer still knew the truth. "I'd like to testify," Keller said quietly. The bailiff hesitated. The judge frowned. "On what matter?" Judge Whitmore asked sharply. Keller swallowed. "On the night Daniel Hill died." The courtroom erupted into whispers. Keller explained slowly, carefully. 15 years ago, he had been first on the scene of the crash. He had noticed inconsistencies, damage patterns that didn't match weather-related loss of control. He had filed preliminary notes suggesting foul play. 2 days later, he was summoned, his report rewritten, his objections dismissed. A senior officer, now retired, had offered him a choice: comply or lose everything. Keller complied. He lost everything anyway. His voice shook as he spoke, not from fear, but from relief. "I was paid," Keller said, "to keep quiet, to call it an accident." Judge Whitmore's face had gone pale. Lucas rose immediately, citing perjury laws, corroborating documents, Emily's reporting, and the digital archive now displayed on courtroom screens. The USB's contents unfolded methodically, emails time-stamped, financial ledgers aligned, names recurring across decades. Ethan Whitmore's composure cracked for the first time. Judge Whitmore struck the gavel repeatedly, calling for order, attempting to regain control. But control had slipped. Federal observers in the gallery exchanged glances. Phones buzzed quietly. The courtroom was no longer isolated. It was exposed. Judge Whitmore abruptly adjourned proceedings, citing the need for review. As people rose, as voices overlapped, Marcus remained still. He looked at the bench one last time. Richard Whitmore did not meet his gaze. The shadows had been disturbed, and they could not return to silence. The fall of power was not loud. It was procedural. Within 48 hours of the adjournment, Judge Richard Whitmore was formally suspended for conflict of interest and judicial misconduct. The announcement came in a brief press release, measured language, neutral tone, but the impact rippled outward immediately. Federal oversight took control of the case. Courtroom 3B was sealed pending review. For the first time in decades, the Whitmore name did not command silence. Marcus Hill watched the news from his apartment, standing rather than sitting, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the screen. He felt no triumph, only a steady release of pressure he had carried since he was 15. The retrial began under a different roof. Federal court was brighter, colder, stripped of the ornamental weight that had once protected shadows. The presiding judge this time was Judge Eleanor Brooks, a woman in her early 50s with iron-gray hair cut just above her shoulders and a posture that conveyed neither warmth nor hostility, only focus. She had built her career prosecuting public corruption before taking the bench, and it showed. Her questions were sharp. Her patience was limited. She tolerated no ambiguity that smelled of manipulation. Ethan Whitmore no longer looked relaxed. The tailored suits remained, but the confidence had thinned. His movements were tighter now, his jaw clenched more often than not. He avoided the gallery, avoided eye contact with the press. For the first time, he looked like a man facing consequences rather than negotiating around them. Marcus testified on the third day. He spoke plainly, no dramatics. He described the night his father died, the face he saw, the years of silence, the investigation that followed. He presented the USB, now fully authenticated. Daniel Hill's emails, financial data, timelines that aligned perfectly with the money laundering schemes still active under Ethan Whitmore's control. Lucas Grant followed, dismantling years of legal misdirection with methodical precision. His voice never rose. He let documents speak. When the defense objected, Judge Brooks overruled without hesitation. Lucas had changed since Marcus last saw him at the diner months earlier. The idealism remained, but it was grounded now, sharpened by responsibility. He understood power better, and he no longer feared it. Emily Carter took the stand last. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, her notes neatly organized. She spoke not as an advocate, but as a witness to patterns, documenting intimidation, suppression, and the systemic erasure of inconvenient truths. She presented Walter Pierce's documents, Thomas Keller's sworn testimony, and her own verified reporting. Her voice faltered only once when she described the break-in at her apartment. Then she steadied herself and continued. The defense had little left. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Guilty, on all counts. Murder, corruption, conspiracy to obstruct justice. Ethan Whitmore did not react. He simply sat there, hands folded, staring straight ahead as if the world had moved beyond him without asking permission. Life imprisonment was imposed without flourish. Outside the courthouse, snow began to fall. The exoneration of Daniel Hill came quietly, but it mattered more than anything else to Marcus. The official record was amended. Cause of death corrected. Responsibility acknowledged. A man once dismissed as collateral damage was restored to the truth of who he had been. A whistleblower, a father, an innocent man. Marcus attended no celebrations. He declined interviews. He returned to work weeks later, reinstated without ceremony. Some colleagues looked at him differently now. Others avoided him altogether. He accepted both responses without comment. December returned, full circle. On a cold evening, just days before Christmas, Marcus stood in front of a familiar house in Riverside, Ohio. He had bought it back months earlier. Quietly, deliberately. The paint was fresh now, the porch repaired. The windows glowed softly from within. Elaine Hill stood beside him, bundled in a wool coat, her hair fully gray now, but her eyes clearer than they had been in years. She watched as Marcus climbed a ladder and hung the Christmas lights along the eaves, the same pattern his father had used 15 years ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. When the lights flickered on, she covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. This time she did not hide them. Inside, the house smelled of pine and warmth. A small tree stood in the corner. On the mantel rested a framed photograph of Daniel Hill, younger than Marcus remembered, smiling easily. Emily Carter mailed Marcus a signed copy of her book weeks later. It became a national bestseller, not because it was sensational, but because it was precise. Truth had weight when presented without fear. Lucas Grant was sworn in as a federal judge the following spring. He took the oath without fanfare, declining speeches, declining congratulations. Those who knew him understood. He would never confuse the bench with authority over others, only responsibility. Late that night, Marcus stood alone on the porch, the Christmas lights reflecting softly off the snow. He closed his eyes, breath steady, and allowed himself one quiet moment. "Dad," he whispered, voice barely audible, "this Christmas, I brought you home." The wind carried the words into the night, and for the first time, the fire inside him rested. At the end of this story, the lesson is simple and human. Justice does not always arrive on time, and it rarely comes without cost. In real life, doing the right thing often means standing alone, being misunderstood, or carrying pain in silence for years. But this story reminds us that truth does not disappear just because it is ignored. It waits. And when people choose integrity over comfort, even the quietest voice can change everything. In our daily lives, we may never face courtrooms or powerful enemies, but we all face moments where we must decide whether to stay silent or protect what is right. Kindness, patience, and faith matter more than we realize. Every honest choice leaves a mark, even when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or what part of the story stayed with you the most. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach those who need them. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps in times of doubt. If you believe in justice, healing, and faith, type Amen in the comments.